Welcome, everyone. How y'all doing this morning, almost to afternoon? Nice to see you all. My name's Stuart DeQ. I'm the executive director of the Yale Center for Business Environment. Come on in, join us. Lots of pizza and seats, please. And this is part of our author talk series. So just a little bit of context and history here. So this started actually over a decade ago when we had a wonderful author come to campus, and we made him go through about like 70 different meetings and meet every single person we could on campus. And that was Vincent Stanley, the author of The Responsible Company, from Patagonia. And Vincent connected across the entire campus. And one of the things that we really came to and realized within that was like, in a world that is overflowing with information, where more data is being produced each year than kind of all of human history combined, like the people who've taken the time to really sit down, slow down, synthesize, and think deeply on things are more valuable than ever. And so with Vincent crafting this series over the number of years, where do we feature and highlight those individuals? And Vincent also, as many of you know, leads a wonderful discussion group on campus, the CBEY 2050 Fellows, and has done that for over a decade, kind of working with students from every school and department, really thinking about the kind of largest and most important issues in society, the environment, and the economy. And Vince is going to introduce John, but I just want to say one thing about this, is that we actually hosted John not for an author talk, but an article talk a little over a decade for one of his first articles on regenerative economics. And there was a joint degree student named Sarah Wilson, who was in her third year. And she's now the head of sustainable responsible investing at Nuveen. And Sarah came out and she was like, I've been waiting for that conversation for my 3 years at Yale. I wanted something that was longer term, that thought about a real redesign of the system, and that really gave me a perspective on where kind of economics and the environment could meet. And it was an incredibly breath of fresh air for her. So I hope that this conversation also serves as a breath of fresh air for you all on campus, where John's now put this together from article to a whole host of other things in book. But Vincent, John, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. So, welcome. Big thanks to Stuart and Heather and Kathy. And I have to introduce John as a friend and a compatriot. And his new book, Regenerative Economics, actually, the first part of it encompasses the paper that he introduced at Yale 10 years ago, with some commentary at the end of each chapter on how his thinking may have changed. But the second part of the book is entirely new and represents a lot of new thinking from John's travels and discussions with people since the original paper was published. So I want to start off. Well, I should introduce John. John is I hate to say this at SOM, but John is actually a reformed investment banker who was at JP Morgan for almost 20 years, and was also involved in the development of derivatives in the 1980s as an investment instrument, and came to a time. There's a great book by Herman Melville called Bartleby the Scrivener, A Tale of Wall Street. And Bartleby works on Wall Street and comes to the point where anytime he's asked to do something, says, I'd prefer not to. And I think John came to that point around 2001 and started an investigation into what a different kind of economy might look like. How is the economy serving us, but also how is it failing us in major ways? Developed the Capital Institute in 2010, which is his think tank, his organization, and also now runs a major course on regenerative economics, and has had what,
close to 2,000
plus students. So we have the book here. Its official publication date, I think, is a couple of days from now. And I wanted to...
By the way, Vincent, did you know did we ever talk about Bartleby? I don't think we have.
No, but I love Bartleby. So
That's incredible. Is my mic on? Does that work? The first thing I did after I left Wall Street in 2001 was sail across the Atlantic Ocean. And we got hit by a humpback whale and had to get rescued. And one of us was reading Moby Dick, which was me. And so I've been intrigued with Melville ever since. And I just discovered Bartleby. I'd heard of it, but I just discovered it recently. And I'm actually thinking of writing a memoir someday and calling it I'd Rather Not.
yeah,
So it's incredible that you shared that story.
yeah. It's probably the first great piece of existential literature. The capacity to say no as an act of agency. So one of the things I think that you've undertaken a bold redefinition of economics in service to life and also in service to all of life. And with a viewing human beings through a critical lens of saying that we're a part of the biosphere. The biosphere does not exist as an environment in service to human beings. And I think that there's a wonderful quote from the book I want to just read very briefly. If we're a part of nature with a regenerative capacity and a role to play, industrialism as unfinished business of self-organizing human creativity, rather than merely the misguided arrogance and greed that has led us to the destruction of the natural world. You also refer, going back, and I think this is sort of the origin of classical economics, is the separation of political philosophy and economics. Because economics also used to refer to value as including human values of benefit, as well as price and cost. And when it separated off from political philosophy, it became more of a quantitative science.
Mm-hmm.
So given all this, and given the sort of crisis we face now, I think one of the things, if you look at the management of the economy, the global rules were established in 1944 at Bretton Woods toward the end of World War II. And those rules are more or less still in place, yet the population has increased by 4 times. The value of the economic activity has increased about 20-fold, and yet the capacity of the planet is about the same or probably reduced since it was in 1944. So with that, I think I want to ask you a little bit about your broad redefinition of what the economy is, in which you say that the economy that we measure is actually about 13% of the real economy. And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. First of all, thanks to everyone for having me. It's great to be back here and share some of this with you on an exciting day for me. This is the first book I've ever written, and this has become my life work. I guess where I would start is to say that what we now call the polycrisis. Is everyone familiar with that concept? I assume that this series of interconnected crises that are political, social, economic, environmental, ecological, are exactly what many, many people anticipated decades ago. Like, we are living what the design of our global economy was designed to create. And somehow I kind of intuited that before I understood that. And once you understand that, you can't keep working on the problems the way the conventional wisdom is working on the problems, because you realize that we're not working on the problems, we're working on the symptoms of the problems. And so, the economy is this kind of thing that's so big we can't get our hands around it. I gave a talk recently, and a very well-regarded European CEO, sort of the modern, Yvon Chouinard of this country's business, doing everything the way you're supposed to do it. He literally said, I don't spend any time thinking about the economy, which shocked me, because here's a business leader, a CEO, who doesn't spend time thinking about the water that he is swimming in. And so I've pursued this inquiry because I've been convinced for 2 decades now that the economic system we've created physically cannot and will not continue as it has been going. And so the question is, are we doomed, or is there a pathway through this, let's call it a metamorphosis? And I'm now convinced there's a pathway through as a metamorphosis, but it's not going to be through fixing problems and incremental change and doing things a little better. And if we need an example of that, Patagonia has been doing things better and better and better since it was born, and has just put out a 150-page report saying, what's the quote? We're not a sustainable company. We can't be sustainable, or something. What was the?
Yeah, no, I think there's a general recognition that everything Patagonia does is to reduce the harm it does.
Yeah.
And the great quote is from our head of materials, who said, every time you reach another layer of the onion, you just cry all the more.
So, but the response to this in the realm of economics, the intelligent response has been developed. There's a discipline that's developed called ecological economics, which is not to be confused with environmental economics. We could spend a little time talking about that, but we won't, since we're at Yale. But ecological economics has developed this idea that the economy is embedded in the biosphere, and that GDP growth is a bad measure of success. But ecological economics, and the founders, the creators of that discipline that is now 50 years old, are my teachers, my heroes. Herman Daly, in particular, who passed away a couple of years ago, should have won a Nobel Prize. But the limitation of ecological economics is that the only rational response to this exponential growth on a finite planet problem is we need to shrink the economy, and we need to learn how to share better. And I'm dramatically oversimplifying. And if that were the case, it'd be hard not to be pretty depressed. If you start with human nature, start with all the needs for genuine development in the majority of the world, and then you get to the darker sides of human nature that do things that we don't necessarily should be doing. But the thing about this regenerative idea is that regeneration, simply stated, is the process that explains how life works. And life has been evolving and complexifying, as I've learned from people like Marilyn Tucker, who's sitting here today, for billions of years. And so there must be a way for us, for humanity, to participate in this process we call life, that's profoundly different than the way we've organized the economy. So this has nothing to do with socialism versus capitalism. It has nothing to do with liberal versus conservative politics. This is a design issue. And to state it as simply as I can, and getting back to your point about economics, the discipline of economics was built on a foundation of Newtonian physics. I demonstrate that in my class. I take my word for it today. I demonstrate it in the book. And the logic of Newtonian physics is the logic of a machine, the mechanistic logic of the machine. And we use language today, like that doesn't move the needle, and we need to optimize this and productivity that. And my proposal in this book and with this idea of regenerative economics is that we need to see the economy as not a machine, but as a living organism. And it needs to align with the patterns and principles that explain how living organisms actually work. And that single shift changes everything. And I believe it offers a credible, scientifically rigorous pathway through what we're calling the polycrisis into a metamorphosis of an economy that is going to look very different than what we're currently doing, only not as bad. And none of us know what that's going to look like. It's like, imagine there's a caterpillar that's going through metamorphosis, but no one's ever seen a butterfly. That's where I think that's the moment we've all chosen to be living on this planet in this experience, this project called the Human Project. I'll stop talking.
I think there's something, one of the things I picked up from the book that I hadn't picked up from your earlier work was a redefinition. And ecological economics talks about the economy as kind of the sum total of GDP, worldwide GDP, and also of financial assets and value of land. And you really redefine it as that's the 13% of the whole intellectual and cultural inheritance and the whole inheritance of natural capital.
Yeah.
The value of everything in the natural world. And how has that changed your thinking if you look at the economy in that way?
So this is a huge topic. I'll try to be succinct, but if you start with the premise that the economy needs to behave in accordance with how life works, one of the things we learn if we study how life works is that it's self-organizing, self-governing. So there's a nod for we're not going to regulate our way out of this. Self-fueling, and ever evolving, ever complexifying. And as I was wrestling with, can we apply this idea beyond just a sort of simplistic metaphor? Could the economy actually function as a living organism? And if it was going to function as a living organism, how could it ever be self-governing, self-fueling, and self-regulating, self-organizing and self-regulating? Because if it could be, that would be way better than trying to think about how we're going to use public policy to design and then enforce the gazillions of regulations that would be required to keep the economy from breaking the planet and to keep the economy from essentially sucking all of the financial resources up to the top, which is essentially what it's been doing. And Peter Barnes's work is what triggered the epiphany for me, more broadly, the concept of the commons. And again, going back to something you said earlier, we've designed the current architecture of the global economy essentially in the context of the post-World War II reality, where the population was a fraction of what it is. The problem was in Europe, we're all trying to kill each other. And so we needed a system that responded to that context in that time. And we live in an entirely different context today. No one had thought about climate change, for example, in the post-World War II era. And remarkably, we've never actually gone back and fundamentally rethought and re-architected the global world order. We've fought about ideology, free markets, deregulation, blah, 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 back and forth. But we've never really said, well, wait a second. The context is radically different. So what would we do if we were to start from scratch? And this is where the commons comes in, and this is where this 13% comes in. It seems to me, and this work is essentially Peter Barnes's work of 20 years, and an entire subculture of folks thinking about the commons in a very significant way. And by the way, all of this is, you could critique all of this as a regurgitation of indigenous wisdom, just to put that out there. Although it's different than what the indigenous people intuited thousands of years ago because we now have massive advances in science. So we understand a lot more than they possibly could have. But remarkably, we're coming back to what they understood and intuited. And so real quick on the commons, most people, when you say commons, they think of natural commons, forests, the grasslands, the oceans, space. So let's start with that. Bob Costanza, who's one of the leading ecological economists, he and a group of scholars have done work over a decade or more to try to put a value on ecosystem services. Anyone familiar with all this, the ecosystem services concept? And we could debate whether that's a good or bad idea, and that is a controversial idea to put a value on nature. But let's just take, for example, for the point of this conversation, that it's better to try doing that than not even bother trying. And when you do that, you come up with some very, very large numbers. The value of the butterfly, the value of the bees pollinating the flowers, the apple trees, et cetera. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's a multi-trillion-dollar number. Then the other commons, though, is the cumulative knowledge of humanity that is relevant to the human economy, which is everything from the design of the microchip to the design of the steam engine, to the design of the railroad, to the libraries down the hall, to the everything, boom, 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 boom. And anyone born today is born into a world of that co-inherited wealth, just like they're born into a world where the internet exists. And they're born into a world where there's, generally speaking, fresh air to breathe and forests that keep the water cycle in balance, et cetera. And so it seems to me if the metabolism of the economy at current scale is breaking the biosphere, that's a simple way to think about it, then we need a mechanism, a self-regulating mechanism to keep the economy operating safely within the biosphere, this idea of safe operating space. And yet we're thinking that the only tools we have are either regulations or markets. And so we squabble over whether to use markets or whether to use regulations and which is good and which is bad. But the point is that we're using the wrong tool. It's like we're trying to eat consommé soup with either a fork or a knife, and we need a spoon. And the spoon is the institution of the commons. And if we had an institution of the commons complementing the institution of the private sector, complementing the institution of the public sector, then the private sector and the public sector could do what they're good at doing with all of their limitations. And we'd have an institution that preserves the integrity of the commons. And just to put a couple of examples on this, and so this is where the 13%, back of the envelope, very rough, I did this analysis that said that even if you add up the value of the natural and technological commons crudely and in a way that doesn't address the sacredness of life, for example, you come up with values of the commons, both technical and ecological, that dwarf the value of the private sector. Dwarf. The number I came up with, 13%. Doesn't matter. Let's say it's 50%. The point is we're trying to manage a minority of the true value in this thing we call the private sector with the tools we call regulation and markets. And I don't believe it's possible to succeed with those tools. And the missing institution is the commons, and the missing tool, we could call it a quota. Think about how a fishery works. A fishery only stays sustainable when there's a quota system. And the fishery operates and generates tremendous abundance, and we eat tremendous amount of fish. We just don't eat all the fish. And the fishermen or fisherwomen need to purchase a permit. And so here's where the self-fueling comes in. If businesses need to purchase a permit to use the commons, natural and technological, you're going to generate trillions of dollars of revenues, which becomes the source of our it becomes the way to monetize our co-inherited wealth without destroying it. So if people that are in favor of a guaranteed minimum income think that the only way to achieve it is through a tax, well, if we honestly manage the natural and technological commons in such a way that we protect it, there will be a cost to use it. And that cost of using it will come out of the private sector, who is now, so translate this to one of our favorite companies, Meta. Mark Zuckerberg, whether he invented or stole this idea, he's created a new industry called social media. But he's put a business model on Facebook that is extractive and destructive and has created a health crisis in humanity and certainly our children. If there was an institution of the commons that had the duty and the legal authority to manage the internet for the long run, Zuckerberg's company would have to buy a usage right because he massively uses the internet. And he wouldn't be able to use the business model he's using because the trustees of the internet common would have the wisdom to say, no, we actually don't want all of our kids addicted to their phones. That's a bad idea. Come up with a better business model. And the business model would probably look more like a subscription service. And it'd be much more transparent about what's really happening. And Zuckerberg wouldn't be worth whatever he's worth, $100 billion. He'd probably be worth $10 billion because the business couldn't possibly be as profitable without the addictive advertising model. But the business would still exist, and Zuckerberg would still be a billionaire. And the usage fees for the internet would be distributed to all of us who grew up in a world where the internet existed. And if you think this is impossible, the state of Alaska has exactly this trust arrangement set up for their oil reserves. So if you're born in Alaska, you get a check every month because you're a participant in the co-inherited wealth of that nation, of that state.
Yeah. So just a quick question on that. I'm curious because you talk about sort of the three pillars, social pillars we have now: private, civil society, and government.
Yeah, I didn't mention civil society, but I should have.
Yeah. And so how would this structuring of the commons or this institutionalization of the commons be different from what an NGO does or what a government does? Because it's a little different, but some of what you're describing is how the FCC was originally set up to regulate television or public airwaves.
So it is, there's not a black line between this and regulation. I'd be the first to grant that. But the problem with the public sector is that it's governed and managed either by, well, let's assume democracy actually worked and was a thing. It's still a short-term, elected politicians are forced by design of the institution to focus on the relative short term and the relative trivial issues like fixing potholes. They are incapable, because of the design of the electoral system, to manage for the seventh generation. So there needs to be an institution that's set up that's by articles of incorporation designed to manage for the very long term. And I would argue business, no matter how well-meaning, Patagonia being the best example, literally on planet Earth, now owned by planet Earth, they still have to stay in business. And, it may be that if my vision of the commons, or I should say Peter Barnes's vision of the commons existed, Patagonia would be producing different products because they would find that, there would be new opportunities created and new doorways closed for what they're currently doing. I don't know. I haven't thought through that. But the idea here, again, is not so much that regenerative economics means the commons. Regenerative economics means looking to how life works as the design for the design principles. And if we're missing institutions, we need to acknowledge that rather than pretend that we can eat consommé soup with a fork or a spoon. And maybe the commons is impractical. I mean, it's obviously not a trivial project to imagine. But it's not binary. It's not like either there's going to be John's Institution of the Commons or nothing. There already are commons managed as commons. So if I were 25 years old and thinking about how to do something truly meaningful, I could easily convince myself that I should take on this challenge of institutionalizing the commons and figure out where to start. Because there's definitely places to start. Chances are they're going to be more local than global. Chances are they're not going to be the atmosphere and CO2 emissions. But if we build models at smaller scale and learn how to govern them, which, by the way, Elinor Ostrom won a Nobel Prize in economics for her ideas on how to manage the commons, suddenly the idea of thousands of commons won't seem radical. And then suddenly the idea of, well, we actually need a commons to manage the internet. Or here's an idea, we need a commons to manage artificial intelligence. Might seem no longer impractical. And by the way these things change, sorry, Vincent, is not slowly and incrementally. They happen slowly and then quickly. And so that's complexity science. That's science. That's not an opinion. And so, I've been working slowly on this idea for 15 years now, and it is still miles away, but it could change very quickly. And what will cause things to change quickly is pressure, and the pressure is building. And that is science. That's not my opinion.
There's another, by the way, if any of you are interested, there's some in between indigenous wisdom and the modern idea of the commons is the work of Henry George in the 19th century, who was tremendously influential in his time. Ran for mayor of New York, by the way, and beat out Teddy Roosevelt, although he didn't win. But I don't want to go into his theory now, but if you Google him or chat GTP him, it's an interesting antecedent to the kind of thinking going on now. We have a few minutes before we open up to questions from the folks here, but in relation to what you were just talking about, there was a wonderful quote you had from Ilya Prigogine, who's one of the developers of chaos theory. He said, when a complex system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to shift the entire system to a higher order. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe talk a little bit about your insights into Mondragon, or if it's related to that, or if it's not, just for the idea of science.
So first thing I should say is, so Ilya Prigogine was a Nobel chemist. And there's some question about whether he actually said that, which I didn't know when I wrote the book. Yeah, exactly. That's apparently true of a lot of quotes. But I think whether he said it or not, the spirit of it is consistent with his thinking. I think a more interesting question is my assumption that what is true, he was a chemist. So what exists in chemical systems, which is probably the context he was thinking, do they naturally extend to social systems like an economy? And that's an interesting question we could discuss. I don't know if there's a way to answer that. My intuition tells me that it's profoundly relevant. And maybe that's just because I want to, live with some peace in my life, that the island of coherence I've created in my course community of a couple thousand people from 80 countries, which doesn't even show up as a speck on the planet, could actually have an impact on shifting the system. Now, there's other science that would suggest that this is not just intuition, but this is a fair assumption to make, and that is the 2022 Nobel in physics, for an idea called quantum entanglement, universal entanglement, and which is essentially, in layman's language, and I'm not a physicist, everything is literally connected to everything in ways that we can't imagine. And what that means is just the conversation we're having in this classroom and just the thoughts that are in your minds as you're listening and thinking, does this make sense, will impact something in your life in a way that none of us knows yet. And that will change the outcome of this thing we call the human project. And so that is established science now, Nobel in physics. And by the way, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Mary Evelyn, that extends across the universe, not just planet Earth. So just think about that for a moment. Everything we do affects the outcome, even though we can't sort of put together our 3-year plan and declare victory because we've met our metrics and claim success and become Time Magazine's most important person. That's not the way reality works. So that's all I have to say about that. Mondragon is a fascinating case study that every business student should be required to study, in my opinion. The trouble is, if it was assigned, most people would study it as an example of a cooperative, because it is a cooperative. It's in the Basque Country in Spain. It grew out of the Spanish Civil War, and in a context of abject poverty and the absolute need to create employment for people. The idea was created by a Catholic priest, and the dignity of work was at the center of the idea. And it grew up as a series of businesses that were structured and organized as cooperatives. So the workers own these businesses. Literally, 100% of these companies are owned by the people who work there. There's now 80 businesses, I think, and 20 billion euros of annual sales. So it's not like a little project. Now, the reason it's important for this conversation is that most people look at it and say, oh, co-ops are the answer. I've got a new fork. I look at it and I say, it's the regenerative economy. And why I say that is because the essence of the Mondragon cooperatives is that they manage these 80 businesses and their own university and their own bank as a single organism. They literally transfer surplus profits from one business sector to another on an annual basis, rather than allow one business to become incredibly quote unquote successful. They recycle that surplus into the health of the whole. And when you ask the people that work there and run the place, they say we're capitalists. This is not some socialism experiment. And they exist. You're not 20 billion in sales and existing in a little, edge of the economy. They're right in the middle of the global economy, and it's hard, and it's not all pretty and safe and perfect. But in the history of Mondragon, no one's been laid off who didn't want to have a job. They find work. If this business is shrinking, they find work over here. That's their commitment to each other. There is no billionaires that have been minted out of the thing. And if you ask them, why do you do this? They say one word: legacy. The legacy of the Basque culture, which, by the way, the Basque language is older than Latin. So, we teach in business school about purpose. This is so far beyond purpose. It's who they are. But for the point of this idea of regenerative economics, understand that they intuitively are managing this ecosystem for the health of the whole, and manifesting potential that didn't exist in anyone's spreadsheets and forecasts as a result of that. And that's the great hope of this, is that where our future prosperity will lie is not something we can see today. It exists beyond the material world of stuff we can put in our spreadsheets and measure. And maybe I would just finish, since I'm sure this, if you take one thing away from this, this conversation today, it's that not that all of our metrics and measures and goals and objectives and KPIs are wrong or bad and they should be thrown away. No, it's that they're limited and that the real juice exists beyond what we know. And we can tap into the real juice if we create the conditions aligned with how life works, because life has been doing that for a real long time.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to, Heather, do you want to manage, are you managing the questions?
So I don't know.
Well, I think the chap in the white sweater had his hand up first and the woman next to him second. Okay.
First of all, thank you so much, both of you, for this talk.
Nice sweater.
I'm totally convinced of what you're trying to do here, and I'm kind of trying to focus on like the operationalism of this model. One thing I came across also in a course here on like global finance, what we talked about a lot is the role that now the very few, very powerful tech entrepreneurs play. And you mentioned the example of Meta and Facebook. So I was wondering, you described kind of the movement of commons as a bottom-up kind of process. And I'm wondering, how do you see them then if we, for example, to establish like a more powerful commons of AI, commons of social media, how would you see them interact then with that movement? Because that would go directly against, obviously, their model, their incentive. So I was wondering like how you think about that and how to mitigate kind of that.
They would not be my friends. And that's a huge theory of change on how to get from here to there is honestly, I don't have an answer. And B, it is a project in and of itself. And I think, what do I think about that? I think ultimately it will be something that culturally is demanded if our consciousness evolves to understand this. Like it's kind of like you don't need a regulation to love your children. Like it's an innate thing we do, unless there's a problem. But in general, we innately love our children. And we need to grow to the point where we innately recognize that giving someone a pay package of $1 trillion is just not okay. And it would never even be conceived of. And the board chair of that company, who by the way is a woman, so it's not like we just need to fix the diversity problem on boards, rationalizes that as if Musk needs an incentive to get out of bed in the morning when he owns $400 billion worth of Tesla stock. So like we're not going to solve this problem through rational analysis. We're going to solve this problem because of a shift in consciousness, is what I would say.
Take one on that side.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Is this? Yeah. Okay. Two questions. You can choose which to answer. And thank you so much for your thoughts. This has been really rewarding. My first is using the example of AI. I feel like there's a concentration, almost by class, of the recognition of the value AI can provide. What do you do when members of the commons don't recognize the value of the common in which they are a part? My second question, I come from a political science background. I worked in the nonprofit sector for years. I came to business school because I thought this was a better frontier for building a regenerative model of capitalism markets. And so I think your idea is really exciting. What role does the public sector play in the three-pillar model that you described? Businesses create specific value. The commons preserves and institutionalizes common value. Can you spend more time in that gray area between regulation and regulation of commons?
Might refer them to the end of the book and the policy recommendation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea. There is the last chapter or the second to last chapter, there's a bunch of policy ideas. I just think in the interest of I don't have a succinct way to respond. Well, maybe I will. Again, I think the public sector needs to learn how living systems work, and they need to design policies that steer the economy in alignment with how life works. And I have put forward these first principles, which are kind of design principles to kind of act as a compass. They're not like truth or correct, but they're one person's best effort to articulate first principles. And if our policy creators started with those as opposed to their preconceived political ideologies, we would come up with policies that are a lot closer to steering the economy in the direction we want. And just as one quick example, it doesn't take a genius to suggest that the capital markets have become, a speculative casino beyond anything that any rational person could suggest makes sense other than those who were benefiting from the speculation. Well, if the first principle of living systems is working in right relationship, symbiosis, a win-win, and we think about what speculation is a win-lose transaction, not a win-win relationship. And I can make the case that there needs to be a certain amount of speculation to create liquidity, blah, 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 blah. I get that. But when 99.9% of the transactions happening every second, every fraction of a second are speculative in nature, it doesn't take a genius policymaker to say, hey, we ought to actually tax that as a pollution. We call that a financial transaction tax. Believe it or not, after the financial crisis, I went to Washington and tried to explain this to some people, Obama people, and they laughed at me. They basically laughed at me because the mindset, the worldview is capital markets need to be efficient because efficiency creates growth, and growth is a source of prosperity. So why would we want to tax efficiency in capital markets, Mr. Fullerton? So we need to first change the paradigm before we can even have the policy conversations.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm a big fan of Patagonia, big fan of the world. I had a question about Adrienne Marie Brown is a big thinker. She wrote a book called Emergent Strategy and talks a lot about how social movements should try to mimic natural systems. That there's a lot of wisdom from the world that we can learn in terms of building power and changing how we orient ourselves to each other. So I'm curious, like, in what ways are you familiar with that work and in conversation with people who have been thinking about indigenous communities, like thinking about how we can learn from the world on how better to organize our communities. And my second related question is, I'm curious about, like, how do we, let's say we're all sold on this, like, how do we build that power? And specifically, is the politics of today are broken clearly, but is there like a glimmer in any corner that you've seen that we can kind of point to as like, it's not just a pie in the sky, there's like someone doing this work?
Do you want to? Well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that about Brown, because I'm familiar with her work, but I've not been in dialogue with her. The truth is, this is all one thing. Like, this applies to our health, our education system, psychology, the law. It's a whole redo of everything, because the Western, and this is where I'm going to get myself kicked out of this place, but the Western Academy was built, is the scientific method of modernity evolved out of, Newton. One of my teachers, Stu Kaufman, says Newton literally taught us how to think. And yet, even William Blake, if you go back and read William Blake, he understood that this scientific materialism was a very narrow piece of reality. And so if we've designed our institutions of education and the disciplines that we've now specialized in around this mechanistic scientific materialism, broken things into their parts in order to understand them, as invaluable that is, it turns out that's super valuable for making things that are essentially machines and has led us down a dangerous path for things that we need to manage, like our health, our families, our companies, and our economy. And so this is kind of like a rethink that's as big as the scientific revolution. And so it makes total sense that we're seeing it in healthcare, in psychology, in all of the sciences. And that is actually true. And there's a woman called Jude Curavan who has a term, the unitive narrative. And Mary Evelyn Tucker's work is essentially about this, reuniting. There's a reason why oneness is a word that describes all this. And it's quite delicate to work with indigenous wisdom to not be, the Western knucklehead who's finally listening to what, people have been saying for millennia. And so it's terrifying and it's fascinating to wrestle with. So I predict, I'll make one prediction. I generally don't make predictions because that's a fool's errand in a world of complexity. But I can predict with a high degree of confidence that in 25 years, the synthesis of all of the disciplines back into one way of knowing will be a self-evident thing. Like it won't be radical at all. And if we do that, potential will flow that we can't imagine is possible today. And the reason I say that is I've seen it in my own life and in my own experiences on my own little micro scale. So I know it's not just some pie in the sky theory. I've personally experienced it on the grasslands. Bill Reed in the back has experienced it in the built environment all around the world. So it's real. It is 100% concrete, real. The only question is, how do we, quote, scale it? And we're not going to scale it by replicating the exact same thing everywhere. We're going to scale it by letting it evolve in its natural way in each unique context, which is going to be different everywhere. One of my favorite sayings is, every snowflake is unique, but every snowflake looks like a snowflake. So the regenerative economy is going to be unique in every part of the world, every culture, but it's going to look like the regenerative economy.
And I would just say that I'm massively opposed to the unity of all these fields of knowledge because it will put poets out of business.
It's nothing to fix.
Question from online. John, how do you start talking about this concept of regenerative economics with people who've been steep in mechanistic thinking for so long? And do you have a 5-minute elevator speech that you could start someone with?
Well, one of my teachers is a man named Wes Jackson, who's a scientist, agronomist, but holistic thinker. And he has a good wit. And he says, next time someone asks you for their elevator pitch, tell them you'd rather take the stairs. So this is, every one of these questions are the right questions. And we spend hours, days, months talking about how do you talk about this? Because it's not that we're suggesting that people are stupid. This isn't about smart and stupid. I wasn't smart enough to get into Yale in the way we measure smart. But it's a new way of seeing. It's a new way of thinking. And I don't know, here's maybe a good chance for me to call on my friend Bill Reed in the back row. Bill's been working on this for 30 years, more in the context of the built environment. But I'm pretty sure I know how you'll answer the question of how do you get people to see this, but you've been doing that. So why don't we let you share, how do you actually do this?
Well, give me the hook because I'll keep talking. I'll try to make it short. There was a question that was asked that I wanted to respond to right along those lines. Let me just, my memory is about 30 seconds worth. Yeah, changing the paradigm. How do we change the paradigm? Like we can just change the paradigm. We can't do that. So the question is, how do we shift consciousness in the line of our work? How do we shift consciousness while we're working? And it's actually pretty easy. Is if you shift from, I'm not sure I'm even answering the question now, but if you shift from problem solving, which is a way of fragmenting the world, by the way, so stop problem solving. If you shift to the idea of potential, because life always looks forward. If you can imagine life being walking into a bad hurricane and anthropomorphizing life, life doesn't go to a bar and drink themselves down in sorrows because of the hurricane. They just get to work. Pioneering species, early succession species, mid-level succession species, life gets to work. It's always looking forward. And what we do is we look in our past. We try to manage ourselves by looking at the wake of the ship. So if you can flip the conversation to potential, what is the potential that we can all step into? There's hope there. And hope is the beginning of giving pause and saying, I never thought about it that way. What's John and Vincent are offering this morning is a glimmer of hope, which then opens us up for conversation. So the simple advice, and I'm going to refer to Eleanor Ostrom too. Place is, and John and I argued about place for years, about the importance. I think I won.
You won, yeah.
So is that this idea of the Institute of the Commons, or what is a wonderful idea, and it does happen in place. And so the deliverable for any project is delivering that sense of the commons for every place on the planet, because every place is different. And I'll say one more thing, and that ultimately, how do we hold this complexity? If we can't hold fragments and problems, what do we work with? Actually, what we work with is the essence or the intrinsic nature of every living entity, which requires us to be humble and say that I want to learn from you, you want to learn from me, a system of dialogue, if you will, and the invitation is always around potential. So honoring essence, which is a way to hold the wholeness of each other. And what we have seen is that we have seen the world change in 18 months. And I'll finish with this, is that the hope that we see is when we see an ecosystem or a grassland can be transformed, the beginnings of transformation are evident within 18 months. Socially, we see that in cities and activities around the world, 18 months. And a Jewish friend of mine said, well, Bill, do you know what 18 is in Hebrew? No, I don't. You do. Chai, which means life. So I don't know what you do with that. Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Thank you. I want to close with just a story about Wes Jackson. So Wes Jackson came to, we're getting kicked out at 12:45. So but he's a friend of people at Patagonia, and he started talking about a perennial wheat. His big campaign has been to save the Great Plains. He's an agronomist. He developed 20 years ago a perennial wheatgrass called Kernza, with roots that go 10 feet deep into the ground and actually create topsoil a lot faster than nature can. He started talking to us about this, and we said, oh, that sounds great. Where can we buy some? And he said, oh, you can't buy Kernza. And we said, why not? He says, no farmer's going to grow what they can't sell. So we partnered with a brewery in Portland, Oregon, to use Kernza as an ingredient in a lager. And we got the first 200 acres of Kernza planted experimentally. And this is to your comment about looking forward, of taking, and also of wherever possible to create small islands of coherence out of individual insights. But thank you so much, everyone. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions.
We'll be outside signing books.
Signing books.
So, thank you so much.
Thank you. My friend. I didn't flog my course.
Pardon?
I didn't flog my course.
I did.
I did.
I really love the book, by the way.
Did you?
Oh, it's giving me the hustle.
Guys,
No, Thank you.
Thanks, John.
that's perfect.
That I came. That